But even in the best of times, right, even when things are going really well and everything experience is very smooth and we're getting what we want, and our favorite treats are just an arm's length away, and we're filling our mouths with gumdrops or whatever it is, we're gratifying this thing at the center of our experience, and it can never be finally gratified because experience itself is impermanent. It's just you get to the thing you want, and you gorge yourself on it, and then. Not only
you want a new thing.
You want a new thing. Then you need a drink of water because this lingering taste in your mouth of chocolate mousse or whatever it is too cloying and too much, and you got to wash that out so that you wouldn't want to stay in that state even if you could. And there's kind of this rolling dissatisfaction, even in satisfaction, that we all encounter, even in the best of times, right? Even when you literally can get anything, more or less anything you want. And yet we know at any moment it can be subverted by something terrible happening. At any moment you can suddenly feel like you might be having a heart attack, right? And then that becomes the thing that this sense of me in the middle of everything collapses upon, and it makes life. I mean, this sense of being in this vulnerable center. Right, it makes life this kind of long emergency that can be pacified by, increasingly strenuous efforts to control experience. Right, we have to control this thing because at any moment we're constantly. I mean, if you just look
at any moment we might die.
Yeah, we're avoiding death. But even for those of us who don't think about death very often, I mean, and there are those people. We're constantly modifying our experience so as to avoid discomfort, whether it's social discomfort or physical discomfort, or just every correction in our bodies. I mean, if you just try to sit still for an hour, you'll notice that all of the micro adjustments in posture that you're now no longer making are made because you really don't have to wait long before you feel miserable. I mean, your body, the amount of pain you can get just sitting in the most comfortable chair you can find in your home and just resolving not to move is quite extraordinary. It's just, it's just, there's no position that's comfortable enough that it will be comfortable an hour from now.
Do you ever read the fine print that appears when you start browsing in incognito mode? It says that your activity might still be visible to your employer, your school, or your internet service provider. How can they even call it incognito? To really stop people from seeing the sites you visit, you need to do what we do and use ExpressVPN. Think about all the times you've used Wi-Fi at a coffee shop or a hotel. Without ExpressVPN, every site you visit could be logged by the admin of that network, and that's still true even when you're in incognito mode. Your home internet provider can also see and record your browsing data, and in the US, they're legally allowed to sell that data to advertisers. ExpressVPN is an app that encrypts all of your network data and reroutes it through a network of secure servers so that your private online activity stays just that, private. ExpressVPN works on all of your devices and is super easy to use. The app has one button. You tap it to connect, and your browsing activity is secure from prying eyes. Stop letting strangers invade your online privacy by visiting expressvpn.com/JordanYT. That's expressvpn.com/JordanYT and get 3 extra months free. expressvpn.com/JordanYT.
Okay, so when you rise out of that into this meditative state, well, like what's your experience and what has that done for you personally and ethically?
Okay, so the starting point, which I've just dimly sketched out of being a subject in the head, right? I mean, this is something that I will be familiar to 99% of our audience, or 99.999% of our audience. People feel that they don't feel identical to their bodies. They feel like they have bodies, and now they might be told, okay, you might want to look into this practice of meditation. You might want to just understand yourself a little better. Here, start with this practice. You can close your eyes and pay attention to the feeling of breathing. The sensation of breathing in the rising and falling of their chest, or the air passing in their nostrils. And every time you get lost in thought, just come back to the raw sensation of breathing. That's a very, basic exercise of, what's called mindfulness. And the moment you try to do that, you begin to discover, or some moments down the line, you discover that it's very hard to do. That your default state is to get distracted by a conversation you're having with yourself, and to forget all about this project of paying attention to the present moment. And it doesn't matter what it is, but the breath in this case. And so it is in fact true to say that for most people, I mean, literally 99.9% of our audience, they couldn't pay attention to the breath for a full minute, say, even if their lives depended on it, right? It's just it's simply not in the cards. It's not. It's the fate of the world could depend on it, and someone who's not really fairly well trained in this just couldn't do it. And so that's interesting, right? What's interesting is that despite your best efforts, you get carried away by thought helplessly, moment after moment. Now, being able to break that spell, being able to see thought as thought, I mean, so eventually, once you get some degree of mindfulness in hand, you no longer confine your attention to the breath or any other arbitrary object. You begin to open it up to everything you can possibly experience. So it's just sights and sounds and sensations and emotions and thoughts themselves can become objects of mindfulness. But this is the kind of the crucial, kind of almost binary difference, which produces an immense amount of psychological benefit. The moment you can really notice thoughts themselves as appearances in consciousness rather than what you are in each moment. Because what happens is, in the default case, the thoughts kind of creep up from behind us in some sense. They kind of come out of nowhere, and that just feels like me, right? So I'm trying to...
It's a reflexive identification.
Yeah.
Well, you wouldn't act the damn things out if they didn't feel like you,
Right.
And so they have to have that impulse to action in them that's part of felt identity.
Right. So
you're saying that
yes.
you're saying, and this is part of, I suppose, part of the Buddhist tradition particularly, although not only, that being the puppet of those thoughts is part of what prolongs suffering, at least under some circuits, especially being the puppet of them. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And so this is so, but the people listening to us now can feel this. So we're talking, and people are trying to understand the thread of this conversation, but it's that they have a voice in their head that's competing with this, right? They're trying to listen to us, but they're also thinking, right? And so they might think, well, what the hell is he talking about, right? Like there's just some intrusive thought comes in, or like, oh no, wait a minute, he didn't answer the question. That thought, that feels, if you're identified with it, if you don't see it as mere language appearing in consciousness or mere imagery, right? It feels like me. It's like that is the self. That is
it also feels like what I believe.
Yeah,
and,
it's just
that's
there's
also
no space
extremely
around
interesting.
it.
Yeah, well, one of the things you do in clinical work all the time, especially in the cognitive behavioral field, is you help people identify those thoughts in some sense as objects, to no longer identify with them, and to say, just because you think that, it's not necessarily true, it's not necessarily you, and it's not necessarily helpful.
Right.
Now, we can check and see if any of those three, propositions were true. Maybe it is you, maybe you do believe it, and maybe it is useful. But we're going to start by hypothesizing that some of these automatic thoughts are actually what's driving your misery.
Right.
And I really also see that as a tremendous danger of totalitarian ideologies, because they're thought systems that are almost entirely foreign in some sense to the individual person, that invade that cognitive space that you're describing and then manifest themselves as unquestioning identity. And if they're blinding the person to some underlying reality that's actually revivifying and nourishing and an antidote to suffering, then they're a tremendous block to exactly that process.
Yeah. So there are two levels at which we can address this problem of thought and its connection to suffering. and one is at the level of thought itself, right? So you can replace bad thoughts with better thoughts, right? You can triangulate on your tendency to have one kind of conversation with yourself, and engineer a better conversation with yourself, right? And that's in cognitive
you can
behavioral
stop
therapy.
thinking like a 6-year-old, for example, and start thinking like a 30-year-old.
Right. And
Right.
what's more, a 30-year-old that actually has good intentions for you, right? Like a friend,
Yes,
right? You can make your mind your
exactly.
friend.
Yeah, loved one even.
Yes, yeah. Can you imagine that? So
Imagine that.
So that's a totally legitimate way to climb out of the great hole of suffering that people find themselves in. But there's a more fundamental, and I'm not saying what I'm recommending in terms of meditation and mindfulness here is more fundamental, but it is not. It's completely compatible with that more conceptual discursive layer, right? And some things, I would argue, some things are best addressed on the discursive layer, and some things are better addressed on the more fundamental layer of mindfulness.
When you're sitting meditating, first of all, you're sitting. And so it's perfectly reasonable to adopt a mode of thought that's healthful and productive in relationship to the fact that you're sitting. Those more discursive propositional thoughts that we've been describing, they're higher resolution in some sense, and they're more practically implementable. And so you want to get that in order, but that doesn't mean that this phenomenon that you're describing that's outside the entire discursive structure doesn't exist. And
right.
It's probably also the place we go, at least to some degree, when we go to sleep and we dream and get revivified. It's outside that discursive landscape. And that's necessary for physiological rejuvenation.